All right, so hello everyone and welcome to the Libraries, Archives, and Museums Mutual Aid and Solidarity panel hosted by the Archival Workers Emergency Fund, aka the AWE Fund. Please note that my introductory remarks will be captioned using the auto-generated captions in Google Slides like you see here, and the remainder of the panel will be live captioned by my colleague Jessica Chappell with summary captions. And then full captioning will be available for the panel once the recording is uploaded to YouTube. So to turn on your Zoom captions, please see the bottom of the Zoom pane, where I think that there should be an option to either turn on captions or turn on subtitles. And I apologize in advance for the varying quality of the Google Slides captions. So let's get started. My name is Allison Clemens, and I'm a member of the AWE Fund Organizing Committee. I'm joining this panel from North Haven, Connecticut, where I'm on lands formerly stewarded by the Wampanoag and Quinnipiac peoples. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that everyone joining us virtually from what is now the United States is on former or unceded native lands. And I encourage all attendees to consult the nativelands.ca resource, which will be linked in the chat, to educate yourself on the past and present of the land you're on. I also encourage us all to consider how we and our organizations can be in a relation with the land we're on and its historical and current stewards. So here's a little bit of information about how we'll structure the panel. We'll introduce our panelists for the first few minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion with 4 or 5 questions for about 30 to 40 minutes. So each of the panelists will have a couple of minutes to answer each question, and we'll rotate who the first speaker is alphabetically for each question. We'll then have an approximately 15-minute question and answer session at the end of the panel. And you can enter your questions into the chat as the discussion proceeds, and Jessica will moderate the chat and collect questions there to bring to our panelists during the Q&A. All right. Our first panelist is Anna J. Clutterbuck-Cook. Anna is a historian, reference librarian, writer, and crafter. She works as a reference librarian at the Massachusetts Historical Society and is a volunteer organizer with the Archival Workers Emergency Fund. She is the founder of Persistent Stitches, an all-volunteer collective raising money for resistance, social justice, and anti-oppression work through crafting, and recently coordinated the Persistent Stitches #Auction for AWE Fund event. As a historian, she is interested in the intersection of gender and sexuality, religion, and political activism. She is Michigan-born, now Boston-based, and she lives in Roslindale with her wife and 2 cats. All right, our second panelist is Callan Bignoli. Callan is the director of the library at Olin College of Engineering in Massachusetts. With support from many others, she has been organizing resources to help with advocacy and safe reopening efforts at libraryworkers.net. She also co-manages the New England Radical Reference Collective and the LibRev community at librev.info, is a member of the Library Freedom Project, and serves on the executive board of the Massachusetts Library Association as the Library Information Technology Section Chair. Our third panelist is John Chrastka. John is the founder and executive director of EveryLibrary, the first super PAC for libraries, and the EveryLibrary Institute, a public policy and tax policy think tank for libraries. Since 2012, EveryLibrary has provided pro bono support to over 100 library communities with ballot measures and tax referendums, helping win over $328 million in stable tax funding. The EveryLibrary Institute supports individual library workers through the HALO Fund and libraries through the Fund Libraries crowdfunding platform, along with publishing the journal The Political Librarian. He is a former board member of the Berwyn Illinois Public Library and RAILS, the Reaching Across Illinois library system. Prior to EveryLibrary, he was a partner and associate direct, an association consultancy, was director for membership development at the American Library Association, and co-founded the ed tech startup ClassMap. All right, let's see, just advancing slides. Great. And our fourth panelist is Paula Santos. Paula is a museum educator, cultural organizer, and podcaster. She has held positions in major art museums in New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago. In addition to her museum work, she is the host of the Cultura Conscious podcast and a founding member of the Museum Workers Relief Fund. She is a graduate of the Leadership and Museum Education Master's Program at Bank Street College and earned her BA in Art History from Williams College. Currently, she is a senior manager of learning and engagement at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive Art in Chicago. All right, so many thanks to all of our panelists for joining us. We're very honored to have them and grateful for their time. So let's kick things off with our first question. How did your mutual aid or organizing effort begin? And Anna, if you could please start us off, that would be great. And then we'll go to Callan, John, and then Paula.
All right. So can you hear me all right? Yes.
Yep.
All right. So I'm here representing the Archival Workers Emergency Fund. The Archival Workers Emergency Fund came out of some organizing efforts that began the beginning of March of this year. Everything is still very new. Sometimes I have to pause and realize that we've only been around for a few months. I was actually not a part of the very first organizing call. I went and looked at the date in our meeting minutes folder this morning. It was March 13 of this year, the week that sort of Boston finally went into lockdown for COVID-19. So the conversations began on a couple of listservs related to archival workers. In the days before that, and then there was a Zoom organizing call on March 13, a group of people who were starting to think about the impact that the COVID-19 closures of a lot of archival repositories and institutions that house various kinds of archives were going to have on archival workers who were either losing jobs or being furloughed or just simply being displaced from the archive with sort of no sense of whether they could work from home or had the infrastructure to continue their jobs or take care of their collections. And so the organizing really had to happen remotely because all of us at that point were working. We were all displaced archival workers, not able to access our institutions for the most part. We were all over the country, so we ended up doing a lot of our organizing on weekly Zoom conference calls. A lot of us, I actually found out about the group via a colleague on Twitter who sent me a link to the Google document that had a list of email addresses where you could sign up to be part of the Google group where the organizing information was being circulated. So it was all a very virtual experience from the get-go. And we had weekly conversations that happened on the Zoom platform and then hashed out a proposal that we ultimately ended up submitting to the Society of American Archivists, SAA. We wanted to put that before SAA, a proposal for a mutual aid fund, so that because they had the infrastructure to disperse funds. We talked about some other options, but ultimately wanted to work with an organization that could get money into people's hands as quickly and safely, sort of fiscally responsibly as possible. We didn't want to end up collecting a bunch of money and not have a way to track it and get it into people's hands. So by April 15, we were in place to actually start collecting donations and accepting applications. So that's how we got started, and I'll leave the rest of my thoughts for later questions.
Great, thank you. Now to you, Callan.
So I think the beginning of my most recent organizing efforts probably started around when I was working with a group via the New England Radical Reference Collective to try to influence the Boston Public Library to close. So in comparison to some other places in the country, Boston was not a holdout, but many of the Metro West public libraries had closed by, Metro West is the kind of western metro area of Boston, including places like Cambridge, Somerville, Watertown, Wellesley, places like that. So a lot of the libraries in that part of the state had already chosen to close in preparation for COVID sweeping through Massachusetts for the first time. And Boston had kind of dragged its heels a little bit on that. So we worked together to create a petition and try to mobilize a couple different stakeholder groups that we thought could help us make this this argument to the city. So that wasn't just library workers, it was also people that the staff at BPL knew through other organizing efforts and had other sort of vested interests in the library / social justice and, you know, keeping people safe during the pandemic. So from there, it became really clear that there was not a lot of infrastructure or guidance for other libraries in the country to engage in similar campaigns to advocate for themselves and for the safety of their workers in particular. So fast forward a few months, and a lot of other advocacy campaigns that I had a hand in or helped with, or just tried to pool some resources around with some other folks. And we developed this community called LibRev, which was an offshoot of a conference that we did back in May, to think about library issues from a more labor-oriented perspective. And that was 2 minutes for me, so I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being so mindful of the time too. I appreciate it.
Yep.
All right, so John, the same question to you.
Sure. So EveryLibrary as a political action committee was started back in 2012 as a crowdsourced campaign. So it's in our muscle memory to go out and ask folks for funding to advance a vision or a mission or a set of values. We looked at on our nonprofit side, the EveryLibrary Institute, we have been running a project called fundlibraries.org. Fund Libraries is intended to be a crowdfunding campaign site. We have all the infrastructure set up to do the individual donors as well as corporate or even philanthropic through that 501c3 structure. And I got to tell you, folks haven't been using it as much as they could. I want to put a commercial in later on for the infrastructure that we've got to help support these kinds of campaigns. But when the crisis hit and the focus that was coming forward was not on the library, but on the humans. We haven't been very human oriented as an organization. We've been EveryLibrary. We work on every library initiative that we can be a legitimate support system on. And yet underneath the hood is every librarian, every library worker, every staff member. So we rapidly wanted to retool what we were doing. The idea for Halo about help a library worker out was really inspired by the folks in CILIP, the Chartered Institute of Information and Library Information Professionals in the UK. They've been doing this kind of mutual aid program for years and years and years, decades. And the work that was being done by a few other groups in the Chicagoland area that I saw who had low barriers to people saying, I need a hand. We wanted to be able to set up something that made it as smooth as possible, as quickly as possible. But our one hand tied behind our back is that we don't have a lot of organizational resources that are laying around to apply to it financially. So we had to go back out to that crowdfunding approach. And I'm really happy to say that we were able to, hit people where they were at a moment of concern and compassion.
Great, thank you. And then Paula, the same question.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear from all of you other organizers, and thank you so much for inviting me. So I have to admit that I'm a little bit jealous of the type of institutional support or organizational support many of you have been able to find in your field. The galvanizing force for Museum Workers Speak and our relief fund really was that as soon as museums started to close, which was around mid-March, it was strikingly clear that they were going to shed staff in large quantities. And the people who were affected first and foremost were frontline staff and also educators who were already precariously employed at their institutions. And sadly, the people who have been organizing have seen how true that has become over the last several months since we've closed. So I started reaching into the networks that museum workers have been creating for several years now. Museum Workers Speak was an initiative that started in 2015, and I was there at their first Rogue session. And some of their founding members are also working on this relief fund. There's also initiatives out of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, so Mass Action. So there was already a cohort of people who were highly politicized and were already discussing the precarious labor conditions of museums and how many of us have been kind of strung along in this profession for a very long time. So I started talking to founders of Museum Workers Speak with other colleagues about, you know, we should really be there for each other, which is a really, really big thing, because many of us, even the people who have been, you know, highly politicized, whether it's at Mass Action or Museums Are Not Neutral with LaTanya and Mike Murkowski, we have been pouring a lot of our activism straight back into institutions. And many of us, I think, have felt the brunt of retaliation with that type of activism. So when I gathered everyone's support, I was like, we have to do this for each other. We have to speak to each other. We have to be there for each other. And it has been completely grassroots. We are the ones holding the money. We are the ones sending out the payments and keeping track of our financial management. We have been able to secure a financial host, although I'm looking for more of a fiscal sponsor. But I will also say that it's been so great. Mina, we were just talking before the call started about being in Chicago, and Chicago has labor organizing and just like organizing period as part of the lifeblood of being in the city. So the models I was looking at was not necessarily the arts and culture field. I was looking at models of people who have been organizing mutual aid funds for years, decades in immigration work, people who are organizing unions and who have led, you know, gigantic union strikes, people who have done other types of micro grants. So it was through their guidance and their information that we, you know, were bold enough to just begin and sort of see where it leads us. And so I'm very proud of the efforts of all of us just coming together and saying, this is really important.
That's great. Thanks very much. Let's see, so I've got two screens here. Let's see, I think I figured it out. All right, so our next question is, what are the principles guiding the development of your fund or collective? And Callan, if you want to start us off, then we'll go to John and then Paula and then Anna. And this is pretty structured just in the interest of time, but I should say too, you know, if the panelists want to pipe in and, you know, add something to what others are saying, please do feel free. It's not intended to be overly structured. So I just wanted to mention that.
So I guess the underlying principle is maybe that we're trying to shift power imbalance that exists in our profession that I think became very painfully clear in the last few months. And we strongly believe, I mean, I'm saying we, but I don't know that we really are we. It's been interesting to try to pull something like this together during this time where people don't really have the bandwidth to fully commit to anything at all, and which is 100% justifiable. I'm feeling that way this week myself. So me, I don't know, whatever, I'll say we for the sake of argument, believe strongly that there is a pretty crucial gap around advocacy and solidarity and labor-oriented assistance for library workers in the US, and I'm sure the rest of the world too, but in particular, I focused on situations that are happening in this country. And I would say that we believe that there's a very intersectional need for that to change, because there are so many structures of power and hierarchies and systems of oppression that operate within librarianship that often are kind of being ignored or downplayed via the sort of vocational awe narrative, which some folks might be familiar with, sort of a glorifying of librarianship and putting it on a pedestal that makes it so that, you know, some of these kinds of complaints don't have the same weight, or that we should be grateful that we have the ability to do this great service and shouldn't complain about our conditions being miserable, et cetera. So I would say another kind of key principle of our work is valuing the whole individual person and stressing that, you know, we're not, sorry about my timer, that we're not just pawns at our workplace who should think that because other societal systems have collapsed to support people through the social safety net, it is our responsibility as librarians to fill that gap exclusively. And I will leave it at that.
Great, thank you. All right, over to you, John.
Our guiding philosophy, our guiding principle on this is to try and respond when somebody says that they need it. We always try and support the local legitimate stakeholders when it comes to a bond initiative for a library or a negotiation with a city council or a county government or fighting a school board, you know, for a school librarian position. We try and stand on the side of the legitimate agenda, but the legitimate agenda in a crisis like this is the human need. We set up what I think is a fairly low barrier, at least I attempted to do it in a low barrier kind of way, in order to say, if you represent yourself to us authentically as saying a little bit of help would go a long way, we'll be very happy to give you as much help as we can while trying to spread it out as much as possible. I think Callan's absolutely right about the approach where management and sometimes boards and definitely money speaks for money. And this is a point in our country, in our world, where if we don't take a hard look at the systems that we're perpetuating, it's caused a lot of opportunity for reflection for us as an organization. We're not a big organization, there's only a couple of us who are involved, but we are habitually on the side of what's the strategic plan, what's the management plan, what's the set of plans for this organization. And I have to say, coming into some conversations that we're looking at helping to support in 2020, later in 2020, 2021, 2022, we've started asking some additional questions about how is this developed? Who is involved in developing it? And how deeply into the organization is it truly legitimate? We're trying to be driven by a response that says yes to people's needs without making them jump through hoops, though, with this particular fund, the HALO fund. And I'd like to, to hear from our colleagues here about how they've been able to address that too.
Thank you. All right, and then over to Paula.
Yeah, I think the guiding principles of our fund are truly about providing a way to care for each other as museum workers across departments, across job titles. There is a certain picture in our field. I work in art museums where it's a very particular type of person, highly professionalized, lots of degrees, just like myself. But when I first started talking to one of my co-organizers, Elisa Greenberg, about this, I truly wanted this to be about every single human being who makes the museum run, operate. This, of course, really has presented a ton of challenges that we have discussed at length, which has really deepened our organizing work, which is realizing educators talk to educators, curators talk to curators, facilities talk to facilities. So us trying to just very much doing the groundwork of texting people we know who work at the security desk or asking people to really reach out to their frontline staff. That was really important for us to begin to create this sense that though we may operate at different institutional levels, a lot of the struggles that we have with labor being precarious and our jobs being discarded in some way, we're all experiencing this to a certain extent. Now, I think that one of the biggest guiding principles for us as well has been, like John was talking about, trying to put the barriers of this quite low and believe people when they say they need a hand. That is incredibly radical. You know, I've worked in nonprofits my entire life. There's always this idea that we have to means test in some way. And whether it might not be us means testing, but we're working with a school that is XY number of needy kids or something. So we wanted to be clear about the purpose of our fund, and we deepened that understanding internally as a collective, and then express that through our application, and believe people, you know, as they came forward to us.
I love that. Thank you. Great. And let's see, we're over to Anna now.
And I think I'm gonna echo what other folks have said here in response to this question, which is that the two themes that I really feel like came through really strongly as we were developing sort of like, how are we gonna administer the fund, and like what kind of application are we gonna put together? And I was really struck as one of the people who was in the process, you know, in this collective process of hashing out what are we gonna ask of people and how are we gonna assess applications, that we were all really united on this idea that we wanted the fund to be open to all archival workers, and really clear that we wanted it to be this language of, you know, an archival worker as opposed to a professional archivist. Like, we don't use, you know, we wanted to make sure that the language was communicating that anyone who works in the capacity of, you know, caring for an archive and getting paid for that labor. If you're a student who's working in as a student, you know, in a student job, you know, if you're, you know, an hourly person who's sitting at a desk, reception desk, you know, all those sort of activities, you don't have to have an LIS degree or an archives management degree, or have worked for 30 years to qualify. So trying to reach as broadly as possible, and then also trusting people when they applied and said they needed the money. You know, we don't ask for, you know, prove to us, you know, how much money you have, prove to us that you are the neediest person who has come to us today asking for money. If they are eligible according to the rubric, we put them in the queue and we disperse the money until the money runs out, and then we continue to fundraise. Thankfully, we've only been in the position of having to ask people to wait a week or two before we have enough funding to disperse to them at this point. So knock on wood, we'll continue to be that lucky. But we have it has worked well so far. So I'm really grateful that we are united in those two principles.
That's great. Thank you all for those comments. So our next question is, what do mutual aid and solidarity mean to you? And we'll start this time with John, then over to Paula, Anna, and Callan. So John, if you want to kick us off.
What's not in my official biography, you know, is that I was a theater major in college. I wasn't an actor, I was a stage manager. And I was an okay stage manager. I wasn't a great one, that's why I'm doing this now. But what the stage manager did was to help facilitate the production. And the facilitation was, you know, supporting the director's vision, the dramaturg's understanding and interpretations, all the designers, all the actors, and the producers' money. The support side of it, to me, is, and part of our alignments with EveryLibrary and EveryLibrary Institute is that we are not the smartest person in the room, though we've got, you know, some fun collaborating sometimes on developing the ideas. We are in a position to say, what do you need, and what, which is with our wheelhouse, can we bring it to it? I think mutual aid is a version of that, that is sort of for the in-between times when somebody can be creative. When you're hunkered down and trying to make rent, when you're trying to make your bills happen, mutual aid is intended to take some of that pedantic pressure off, so you can find those moments of joy and creativity in the future. To me, that's what it means. And solidarity is a very interesting conversation to have as a straight, white, cisgendered guy on this call, because what I know to be true about the work that I've done so far is that some of my pathways have been smoother than other people's would have been to do the same kind of work. So it requires me to, and it compels me to, show up with a little bit more integrity when I'm welcome to the table. At least I hope that's true.
Thank you. See, over to you, Paula.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'll use this time to say that our museum collective, our fund, reached our initial goal of $50,000, and now I think we've raised closer to $70,000. And we are at this stage where we're thinking, well, what does care look like, and what does mutual aid look like, in addition to beyond side by side, like direct aid, financial aid. So we're very much engrossed in this thought process currently. But for me personally, as I said before, so many of us who are in this collective and have worked very hard to try to make some very like top-down changes, right? It's like you're in a management position, you're a director position, then at the board level, and that's a very particular type of work, exhausting and compromising in certain ways. And this moment where many of our colleagues were being dismissed or furloughed, I didn't want to go back to the structures that already were so tiresome. It's how can we imagine us just thinking together? Like, how do we think together? How do we work together? How do we imagine together? So mutual aid and the structure of mutual aid has really enabled that type of work because, you know, none of us is, you know, we all exhibit leadership qualities in different ways, but, you know, no one's a director here. You know, there isn't that, mutual aid doesn't allow for that type of system to exist among us. And I think one more thing, which I think is quite lofty, and I think it's something that I'm still thinking about, is I'm just speaking for museum workers, there's been a growing labor movement within museums, which has been great to see. And at the same time, there are still many of us who are very weary of solidarity for a myriad of reasons. And I wanted this Workers Fund to really emulate what it could look like to be politically involved at this level, to organize. So just like the structure of mutual aid has really allowed for us to just dive into all of those ideas in a completely tangible way. So that's where I'll leave it.
That's great, thank you. And Anna, over to you.
I think what I'd like to say about mutual aid is that one of the things I find really compelling about it in the context of American political culture is that we have this really strong ethos of this idea that, like, you know, either you're someone who would never need aid, or you're someone who perpetually needs aid. You're in one group or the other. And what I like about the idea of mutual aid is that the idea that, like, any one of us at some point in our lives is probably going to need support, and at some point is in a position to support others. And I'm now long enough in my field, in my area, that when I first started out about 10 years ago in the archives world, I was talking to contingently employed archivists, and I did a survey of contingently employed archivists in New England, talking to them about what their needs were and sort of what their struggles were, and what the regional organization, New England Archivists, could do to support them. And now when we launched the Archival Workers Emergency Fund, when we had the auction a couple of weeks ago, several of the people that I interviewed at that point for the study who were contingently employed were really excited to, like, contact me and say that they were now in a position to bid on the auction items and, like, support the fund, and ended up donating more than even they had bid on the items that they had purchased for auction. And it was just a really neat sort of closing of these little circles of, you know, these people who were really struggling, that, you know, had moved into a different place in their lives, and were really excited to be in a position to then support the archival community and their colleagues who now in turn were struggling. And so I think the idea of mutual aid really helps us think about that, think about vulnerability in new ways, and economic vulnerability in new ways, and economic security in a more collective way than American culture really encourages us to consider it. And I'll leave that there for now.
Thank you for that. Right, and Callan, over to you.
So I think to speak to maybe solidarity more so than mutual aid, because I haven't been as directly involved in mutual aid efforts as the rest of the panelists have been. I'm really intrigued to know more about this resistance to solidarity that Paula mentioned, because I also ran into some of this in my own work. And there was some people tried to explain to me why it was that they felt this way, and I still don't really feel like I completely grasp it. So that's something that I kind of want to park for later for further discussion. But for me, what it means is that we try to find ways, even if we don't have all of the components in place to, let's say, create a library, a National Libraries Workers Union, we do have some momentum building up amongst our peer group to help us through this time of pain and transition and uncertainty. I think, you know, one thing that became really clear in the work that I did in the last few months was that in the beginning, there was no path forward for libraries that was really being considered in most municipalities or jurisdictions in terms of how they were going to reopen or deal with providing services. And the groups that I was a part of began to compile the little, you know, snippets here and there that were coming out around the country into one place, so that we all didn't try to reinvent this wheel separately when the time came. And I think things like that are extremely important, that, you know, our profession is such a vast landscape of different types of libraries, but different types of regions in the country and things like that. And we don't always speak to one another unless if we, you know, run into each other at conferences. And then even then we don't really get a really, you know, universal lay of the land, as it were. So I think, you know, using our collective brain power and strength to build each other up in the meantime, while we are maybe waiting for that bigger change to take root, that's what solidarity means to me.
Thank you for that. Thanks. So we're going to ask one more of our sort of like pre-prepared questions, which relates directly to some of the conversation that's happening in the chat. And then after we do this final question, we'll move into the open Q&A. All right, so our final sort of like pre-structured question is, how do you see mutual aid fitting into a broader organizing strategy for LAM workers? And this time we'll start with Paula, and then Anna, Callan, and then John. So Paula, over to you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that for us, the Relief Fund collective, we are in conversation with, you know, a fairly large coalition of people who are either unionizing or trying to organize internally in a myriad of ways. If you, if by any chance, are in tune with the museum world, there have been a lot of resistance by workers to layoffs, more pay transparency, more pay cut transparency. So we're very aware of that type of organizing, and we're supportive of it. I think I keep coming back to this idea, and I have heard it from many people, and including in the chat, of, you know, that ideally there wouldn't be need for mutual aid. And I guess, you know, we might have a universal basic income or something like that. But I think that when I think about mutual aid for us and the work that we're doing, I see it as something that it will exist as long as this community needs care. and as long as there are people who want to care for each other. And like I said, money is one thing, and thankfully we've been successful on that front. But I know here's one really, really kind of heart-wrenching thing about it all is that we included a survey with our application, which was completely optional. And there were questions there about, you know, what are some of your museum dreams, or what do you think about this, how everything's going to turn out? And there's so much pain and frustration in those answers. So that says to me, money is one thing, but we need other types of ways to be there and, you know, stand side by side. And creating that space, I think, is what we're working on currently.
Thank you for that. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah. The thing I was thinking about before this conversation started was that I really think that for me, one of the great things about organizing specifically to start this fund was that we had something material to get done and a material, like a reason to continue to get together on a weekly basis to distribute to like fundraise and distribute funds that's keeping this conversation going. And now we're starting to do sort of more, the more long-term, hopefully community building, relationship building with one another and maybe with the broader community. But I think there was real value for us at the beginning to have a real concrete goal and have something that we could point to say, look what we did together, like look what we accomplished in this really material and immediate way. It kind of reminds me, my parents used to work with teenagers at our church growing up, and they said, like, if we want to have conversations with teenagers, like you have to go and do something with them, like get together and go paint something or like go on a field trip, because they're not going to have conversations with you if you just sit down at the coffee table with them and like ask them about their lives. You have to have something to do. And so I think that a lot of the really good conversations happen when you're actually working alongside each other toward a concrete goal, but all this other stuff comes up along the way. So I think that's, for me, that's how it fits right now.
Thank you for that. Callan.
I do think that one of the more positive outcomes of the last few months, and I will disclaim this by saying I really cannot deal with the litany of webinars and papers and whatnot coming out right now that are like using the crisis as an opportunity stuff, because I just think that's ghoulish and messed up in a lot of different ways. But I do think one of the more positive outcomes is that we did shine a light on the need for people to beef up their knowledge of advocacy and organizing of any sort. There's one thing that kind of kept coming up for me, and this is sort of like a pretty basic example, but often in libraries where there were disputes between workers and managers, there was, sort of a need for the workers to try to find some kind of collective solidarity together, but the only means of communication they had with one another was their work emails. So, things like that are as simple as like saying, hey, people who are rank and file staff, you should set up a Signal thread, or you should get each other's personal emails. Those types of things didn't ever really seem to enter like the broader conversation around libraries until these things came up and they forced them to happen. So I think that the mutual aid framework and these kind of like offshoot organizing efforts all feed into like probably a slow moving and pretty big target of, a big target, but a slow moving process of aiming at that target, of trying to come up with some kind of more universal level of solidarity amongst us. So it's hard to know what that's going to look like. I mean, in the last few months, I've certainly heard from a lot of people who really ardently want there to be a National Library Workers Union. I'm not going to weigh in on whether or not I think that is feasible, because I honestly don't know. But I do think that in the absence of that kind of, miraculous future, there are things that we can do to bolster our own ability to pull ourselves up in these situations and protect ourselves from some of the more egregious abuses that were identified during this. And I think this has given us an opportunity to talk about these things at a larger scale than we maybe would have in the past.
Thank you, Callan. And then John, over to you.
I'm extremely worried right now about the tax base that funds libraries and archives and museums. I'm extremely cognizant right now of how libraries and archives and museums are put together under federal programs like IMLS and National Endowment for Humanities, and very few other channels. And at the state level and at the local level, we are all in this together, and yet nationally and at state level, and with a few shining, unusual situations, do we actually work together across lines organizationally. Mutual aid shouldn't exist is a theme in the chat. I don't disagree with it. Mutual aid needs to exist in between paychecks, and when employment, regular employment, not conditional employment, if we don't come together as organizations at a national level, a state level, at a local level, and bridge the gaps between the L and the A and the M and the M and the A and the L, if we're not in the authorization for funding from, say, the federal government, we're never going to be in the appropriation. If we're not standing together in front of funders, philanthropy, elected officials, and donors, the disconnects that exist because we have organizations historically that don't talk to each other and that don't necessarily look at the entirety of the bill that they're in, I think is the greatest single hampering that we have about the financial stability of the L and the A and the M. Mutual aid should be teaching us some new modalities. I got to applaud SAA for what they've done as a national organization, looking at their own structures and a membership organization dipping into their endowment to make something happen. That's a shining example. I think it's fantastic, and it shouldn't be the only one.
Thank you to all of the panelists for your thoughtful answers. It's been really just a pleasure hearing from each of you, and I appreciate it so much. So we're going to move into the audience question and answer portion. So Jessica, what questions have come up? Where should we start?
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come up, but I'm thinking, why don't we continue sort of talking about organizing? Question from Jane Kelly is, I'm curious to hear about what opportunities you might see for building worker power right now. I feel like we're at a time when many of us have to directly negotiate the terms of our working conditions, and we're maybe not equipped to or comfortable doing so. So what can we do, and what can mutual aid networks continue to do in the post-pandemic world to support this kind of organizing?
I think any of the panelists, please feel free to jump in at the risk of having some competing voices. We'll just, whoever wants to start, please.
I will jump in and just say that I think from my own experience, one of the most powerful things to do is have conversations with your coworkers, like normalize talking. I think it was Callan who was talking about having non-work channels to communicate with your colleagues about the conditions of your work. If your networks include people who work at sister institutions in your area, like anytime you can have those contrast and compare conversations with people about what's happening at other institutions. One of the things that I've been doing, my wife and I are both in the library field. Her workplace and my workplace are doing things in a really different way. So as we do the phase reopen, and I've been talking with librarians at various locations at her workplace about what they're doing, and what resources we're consulting, what resources they're consulting to try to figure out, what authorities everyone's talking to, where they're getting their information from, all of that kind of stuff. It's a lot of conversation. I've realized like how much of my life is conversation, but those conversations are really valuable because you're building relationships with colleagues, and you're gathering a lot of information about what norms and expectations are, and what norms and expectations you might actually want to change together that you're unhappy with. You're rarely the only person in your workplace or in the field who's having the same problem you're having. I would almost say never the only person, but there's probably an exception somewhere.
I can jump in. I think this goes back a little bit to, I think it was, sorry, I'm looking at the name, Callan, talking about a little bit about maybe a reticence to show solidarity. You know, organizing is risky. There's a lot of risk attached to forming these informal networks. It really depends on who finds out, what they find out. We have already seen, at least in the art museum world, that the first people to go were the people who organize unions. So I think one of the huge barriers here is that we all need to live and we have a chosen profession, and unless we risk, then we can't gain anything, but the risk, it can be quite great. And one of my sort of, you know, dreams, which we've been talking about collectively for the Museum Worker Fund, is to connect organizers, whether they're immigration organizers or like university union organizers, to lead, you know, workshops on what do you need to organize? You need informal networks. You need, you know, how do you work as a collective? All those sorts of things. What does a list of demands look like? I think one of my own personal frustrations being in this museum field is that, you know, especially I'm an educator. We're really great at getting together and talking about all the things we would like to change, but just talking about it is only one step of organizing. It's like that next step of, you know, is it going to be a list of demands? Is it going to be a letter? Is it, you know, those very like step-by-step things are things that I think that people would really relish, and many people are learning that right now.
Thank you. Other comments from panelists, or if not, other questions that have come up in the chat?
Sure. So we have a couple of questions that are related, and we also have about 7 minutes left, so I'm going to ask both of them. The first is, I have a question for the panelists who have been involved in direct financial aid. How has working with an institution to administer financial aid has been a challenge or a benefit? And then another question that's related is, how can we leverage the power of our respective professional orgs to advocate for more ethical labor practices?
I'm not sure if that question was directed to me or not, but EveryLibrary Institute is set up as a 501c3 organization, and within the 501c3 rubrics from the IRS, there's a tremendous amount of flexibility that's often not used within the library, archives, and museum space. We have a cultural problem within library land that says that 501c3s can only sort of infer advocacy and only sort of hope that somebody shows up to advocate on our behalf. That's not the case. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility on grassroots and direct lobbying activities that can be done by 501c3 organizations. And there's a lot of power within the structure to do things like fiscal sponsorship and fiscal, there's another term for it as well, and it's escaping me right now. There's 2 terms for it. But we want to take here at EveryLibrary Institute the full extent of what's available in that 501c3 rubric and help other people. Like we're the fiscal sponsors right now for a project that's being done, the Awesome Libraries, part of the Awesome Foundation. It's a collective group of people who get together every month, put in some money. Every quarter they vote together on projects to give money to. We're taking care of their paperwork and we're sending checks out for that. There's the least thing that we can do as a national organization ourselves is to help lower barriers. In the mutual aid approach, we've already talked about that. But how can we, here at the EveryLibrary Institute, it's part of our mission, is to say yes to allied ideas, mission-aligned ideas, and say, how can we help? So I'd like to suggest that what the national organizations can and should be doing is embracing their structures in a way that allows for this. I'm concerned that there's some historical disinterest in supporting labor on the part of some of our associations and organizations. I'm also, got to be honest with you here, concerned with some of the feedback that we get when we work with organized labor on ballot initiatives for public libraries, where the local or the state organization shrugs their shoulders and says, good luck on your ballot initiative, even though we're going to be employing 3,300, 3,000 public workers. And we have a lot of problems in education where the school librarian position is often bargained away. I would like to make a challenge out there as we're considering homegrown to get back into the existing unions, that if you have an existing union if you have a local, you got to get involved in it and try and change it perhaps from within, disrupt it from within, challenge it from within. There's a lot of potential good infrastructure out there. The Washington Teachers Union in DC is the best. SEIU in New Orleans after Katrina was fantastic to work with on the ballot measure, but I got a one hand worth of those I can talk about.
I think someone in the chat had asked about the American Alliance of Museums.
Yes.
We have not heard one thing from the American Alliance of Museums, and we know that they are aware of us. And as far as like fiscal sponsorship, that really is the next step for us. And it's mostly because we want this project to be sustainable. You know, right now we're holding the keys, the collective currently, and you know, things happen in our lives and we may not always be that front facing person for the fund. So that's a really big thing for us. And that's whenever people ask how they can help us, you know, there's a lot of people who want to, you know, join us and volunteer for us. I think figuring out an organization that can be, you know, as flexible as John is saying and as responsive as John is saying, to really help us manage the financial aspect of it, because while I can, you know, we can do it because we're a very smart group of mostly women, that doesn't mean that we need to hold it in the way that we have been holding it.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Anna, go ahead.
I was just going to say really quickly that I am actually a sort of an SAA skeptic. I have had some bad experiences with them as a young person in the library profession. When I first started out, they did not have my back. And so I have not been a personal member of SAA and was really very wary of joining the off-fund efforts to the ship. And have been really grateful for the ways that they've come through for us so far. And I think I saw all the practical reasons why using them to sort of administer some of the practical side of things was a really great idea. And just the individual people we've interacted with have been really great. And I think it's been a good sort of the way that we've worked with them as a separate volunteer organizing group. So far, I think we've set it up to have this pilot period that will then sort of continually check in with them. Like, is it working for both sides? The volunteer organizers, I think we still very much sort of want to have those check-ins to see, like, is it still working for both of us? And how is it working? And are we still meeting our goals in terms of how, you know, the ethical priorities that we had, sort of the vision that we had for the fund. So, in the best world, I think we can use those organizations for good, and hopefully that will continue to be the case.
Thank you for that. And I'll say there's also a really nice question in the chat that we won't have time to answer, but that I'd like to close with. And that's, how do we unite all of these wonderful but disparate efforts? And I hope that this event today is a start to that conversation and that effort. And I hope that it's something that continues, of course, in the future. And I want to just close by saying thank you to our panelists for their work and for their willingness to share with us today. And thank you to everyone who attended the event. So on this slide, you'll see there are links to the organizations that are represented, and I can put a link to that in the chat, or Jessica can, before we close. And for those of you who donated as part of your attendance, we're going to be splitting the donations up among the organizations as well. So thank you all so much. We hope that you're able to join us for our next Off-Fund panel. Keep an eye out for the announcement. We're planning something that I think is going to be really great on salary advocacy for early this fall, so that information will be forthcoming. So, thank you, everyone. Jessica just put the link to the slides in there if you want to click on some of those links and learn more.